Welcome to Just One Thing for Parents. I'm Bettina Honan. In this episode, we explore a vital topic for parents: how to support teenagers in building resilience. Matilda Gosling is an expert in evidence-based parenting, and she shares some insights today about the power of healthy stress. So she explains why allowing teens to face manageable challenges can really help develop these essential coping skills and develop resilience without exposing them to toxic stress or leaving them unsupported. It's what we're all aiming for as parents. And what I really love about this episode is that it's truly science-based. Matilda tells us about some really fascinating and informative studies on squirrel monkeys and on controlled tree growth. They're really interesting, and they highlight the benefit of mild stress exposure. We also talk about when parents should step in, and think a little bit about, in today's social media driven world, how adults really have more of an essential role than ever in helping young people to understand their emotional experience and increase their kind of self-awareness. So if your aim is to foster resilience and raise confident, capable teenagers, this is definitely an episode for you. So please listen now for my interview with Matilda Gosling. So hello and welcome, Matilda. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
What's one thing parents can do to support their teenager to be resilient?
I would say that the most important thing is to let your teenagers experience healthy stress. And that doesn't mean toxic stress, and it doesn't mean leaving them alone to cope with all of the difficulties of life by themselves. But it does mean ideally not rushing in to protect them from healthy stress, not rushing in to save them every time that they have a problem, not trying to problem solve for them rather than letting them do that for themselves. And it's a matter really of letting teenagers have experiences that are manageably hard so that they learn the skills they need to be able to cope with future difficult situations. If they don't practice, then they're not going to have the resources that they need in future when parents aren't there to support them and prop them up. And as I said, it doesn't mean leaving them to cope with things entirely alone. So it means kind of being there to love them and support them and talk things through if they would like to talk things through. But effectively, it just means kind of maybe taking a bit more of a step back than parents might have felt comfortable doing when their children were a little bit younger, and letting teenagers find the answers for themselves and letting them fail as well. So I think kind of learning to tolerate failure, learning to understand that the world doesn't collapse if you don't necessarily get things right the first time, is quite an important life lesson, and something that I think parents would be doing very well if they let their teenagers experience.
That's so interesting. And I suppose the word stress has such a kind of emotive meaning, doesn't it? What do you mean by stress when you say stress? Because I think when we think about stress, we think it's going to make me ill, it's going to give me a heart condition, or it's going to reduce my immunity, or whatever it is. But is that what you're talking about, or how would you define stress?
So I think it's about the difficult situations that you might encounter as part of normal life. So if you're a teenager, it might be that you have a tricky relationship perhaps with one of your teachers, or you are going through relationship turbulence with some of your friendship groups. You're feeling slightly overwhelmed perhaps with the level of homework that you've got. So nothing that's kind of absolutely chronic or serious. It doesn't mean stress that kind of drips down on a day-to-day basis and erodes resilience, which is obviously really important to avoid. It doesn't mean kind of ongoing bullying or abuse or social isolation or any of those things that it's very hard for human beings to withstand, or serious illness. But it does mean those situations that really kind of are the building blocks of what we might expect to experience in future. And actually there are a couple of quite interesting studies that have been done that I think illustrate this quite well.
Yeah, because I know that the book that you've written is really about evidence-based parenting, isn't it? I think you've written one for younger
Yes.
children. Now there's one coming out for teenagers. So yeah, it'd be so interesting to hear. Have there been studies that have really? I mean, I'd love to hear about studies. I also think it could be helpful for parents to know. Can you give us an example? Like, what might be an example of a situation that is stressful, but parents should allow their kids to kind of work out for themselves in order to develop their resilience, and then maybe the evidence as well.
Okay. Yes, of course. So I would say that friendship difficulties are probably something that all teenagers are going to encounter at some point over the teenage years, probably on a repeating basis.
Yeah.
And I don't mean by that bullying or social isolation. I mean when they fall out with a close friend, or when other people within their friendship groups perhaps aren't getting on with each other and they don't know what to do about it. And at that point, it might be quite tempting to hop in with some advice,
Yes.
very, very well-meaning, well-intended advice, and say, okay, this is what I think you should do, or if this was me, this is how I might handle it. And I
Yeah.
think if they come to you asking for advice, that's one thing, but I think it is probably better just to take a little bit of a step back, let them try and work through potential solutions or ways of handling it for themselves. Maybe just ask them some questions. So, how do you think you might want to handle this?
Mm.
Or if this was happening to a friend of yours, what would you advise
Mm.
them to do in this situation? You can kind of provide the framework that helps them to think it through. And if they say to you, what do you think I should do? Then obviously you
Yeah.
can go ahead and do it. But I think by kind of jumping in and offering solutions, it prevents that ability for them to apply skills that they've learned in previous situations to this situation, and perhaps to
Mm.
develop new ones in the current situation. And then in terms of
So just
research, sorry.
yeah, I was just going to say, I suppose it's this. I love this idea, which I'm sure people who listen to this podcast heard me say before, but offering this space. So when your
Mm,
child, your teenager comes to you with a problem, it's about just really listening and stopping and saying, "Wow, tell me a bit more about that," and allowing them to talk. And often teenagers just want you to listen, and knowing that when they're talking, actually they're processing it themselves. I think that's
yes.
a really important thing to note, isn't it? And that is
Yeah,
stressful for
exactly.
them. And but what you're saying is that's okay stress. That's stress that they can manage.
Yeah.
They're able, it's not going to push them overboard. And with you alongside them, they're going to be able to get through that.
Yes, exactly. So it's almost like it's a kind of inoculation against being able to deal
Mm.
with future difficult situations. It helps them to experience it in small, manageable doses, knowing that they've got parental support that can kind of
Yeah,
catch them if things fall apart or get too difficult, but that actually they can deal with it themselves. And I think imparting the message that you know that they can cope with it is really important
so
as well, so
great.
that they feel as though they have the tools and the
Yeah,
ability to kind of find
yeah.
solutions for themselves.
And one of the things you said there was practice. And I think that's such an important
Mm,
idea, because when young people can practice doing it themselves with you alongside them, by the time they leave you, and we know that, social difficulties, relationship difficulties is a part of life, they will have a little bit of a model, and they'll have some internal resources where they can deal with that themselves. So that seems
yes.
really important. Can I just, before we move on to the evidence, what would be the situation
Mm.
in which you would say, okay, we'll step in because this stress is too much for them in that
I think
example?
I think it's about for parents, it's about knowing your own child. So knowing the point at which they are not actually managing any longer. So it might be that they are kind of withdrawing into themselves. It might be that they are kind of very sad and quiet. It might be that they are showing their stress in other ways through behaviors. Perhaps they are kind of spending a lot of time online in a way that they might not be usually. But all of these things, they're on a kind of spectrum. So I think it's a question of, for parents, knowing what is normal
Mm.
and normal behavior for their own children, so that they can then kind of notice when things are perhaps not working quite so well. And it might be looking for external signs as well. So, for example, a kind of drop in school grades, or perhaps teachers get in touch saying that they've been noticing unusual behaviour at school, something like that.
Yeah. And just on that, one of the things that occurs to me, I think as a parent, it is the most painful thing when your child comes home and they're struggling, particularly if another child's been unkind to them. And let's face it, children are unkind to each other as they're learning and practicing and trying strategies that are not nice strategies, you know. And
Yeah, and in terms of kind of what I know to do and what I would like to do in those situations, I want to go in and sort it all out immediately on their behalf. But obviously, I
exactly,
know
and
that
go
that
and
is not
talk
the
to that
correct thing for me to
person
be
or
doing.
speak to their mum or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
But we have to manage our internal feelings and say
yes,
that, yeah, that's one of the hardest things I think about being a parent, isn't it? Being able to
yeah,
manage your own
definitely.
emotional reactions to things, because we have this
Yeah,
mama bear or papa bear um kind of reaction just to want to protect them. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
So shall I just quickly talk through a little bit of the
That
evidence
would be amazing. Yeah, thank you.
behind this? So I think with teenagers, obviously you can't run kind of large scale human experiments to discover
Right.
whether you can drop them into a stressful situation and then see what happens at the end of it. But what you can do is kind of track them over a period of time, perhaps with like looking at diary entries, for example, looking at what's happened during the course of the day, and then matching that up with parents' input and approaches to try and assess what works. So we understand that there are links. They're not necessarily kind of cause and effect with these human studies because we can't run those kind of experiments on them. But certainly those kind of daily diary studies do show that there's stress-related growth that comes from allowing teenagers to handle kind of healthily stressful situations for themselves without too much in the way of parental input. And then we can look to the natural world for some more kind of experimental evidence. So there was and this was with obviously slightly younger creatures, but I think the message still carries through. So there was quite an interesting study done with some young squirrel monkeys, and when they were very small, the researchers divided them into two groups, and one of those groups was exposed to what they termed mild adversity, and that meant taking them away from their mothers and their peers for 1 hour a week and then dropping them in with a bunch of stranger squirrel monkeys. And they did that with half of the monkeys, and then half the monkeys just stayed with their mothers and their peer groups. And then they looked at their behavior when they became adolescent monkeys, teenage monkeys, and they discovered that the group that had been separated from their group for 1 hour a week, so had this kind of mild intermittent stress, then they were much more curious when they were dropped into new situations, and they were much more resilient as well. So they'd had that kind of early stress inoculation that then carried them through. And then the other thing that I just wanted to mention is Jonathan Haidt, who's written quite a lot. He's a social psychologist, and he's written quite a lot about teenagers and stress and resilience. He talks
just
about
wrote
this.
The anxious generation.
The anxious
Yeah,
generation,
that's
that's
right.
right.
Yeah, I talk about that actually on my podcast with Beth Kerr. No, not. Yes, I did. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think there's stuff that he says about social media driven mental health crisis, which I'm not sure that I would necessarily interpret the
Oh,
research in the
really?
same way that he does.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of what he's got to say is very interesting. And one of the things that he talks about is a biosphere experiment. So in the Arizona desert, they put together, I think it was back in the 1980s, they built this kind of dome that was meant to be self-sustaining. And they planted a whole load of trees that were meant to create this rainforest ecosystem within the dome. And the trees got to maturity and half of them fell over because they hadn't been exposed to wind. So they hadn't developed the kind of stress response that the wind gave them that allowed their root systems to grow strong enough that they could then withstand these kind of bigger stresses when they got to maturity. So I just thought that was kind of quite a nice
Wow, what a
parallel.
Exactly.
to the human
Gosh,
version.
absolutely. And it strikes me that it's so difficult for parents in today's generation, this generation of teenagers, partly because social media is feeding a lot of information to young people.
Mm,
And there's a danger that young people are over interpreting normal variation of ups and downs of life, of feeling low and feeling
yeah,
anxious, or even some of the neurodiverse conditions, and is being overinterpreted as, I have a disorder, there's something very wrong with me. It's so hard for
yeah.
parents to know, isn't it? Like, when do I push them to keep, to try harder, and when do I protect them? It's just really
Mm.
difficult, isn't it?
And I think there's lots in online quizzes, for example, where teenagers get presented through social media accounts with a quiz to say, do you have anxiety, or do you have depression, or do you have
Yeah.
kind of ADHD or bipolar, or whatever it might be. And because the quizzes are, they sit outside of a kind of clinical environment, they're
Mm.
not necessarily designed to test what is actually going on underneath. And I think a lot of the questions, as you say, they touch on normal human experience. So people will be asked questions to which they answer yes when it's just about normal life. Like, do you sometimes get worried? For example, yes, everybody gets worried. That is part of the normal human experience. They tick yes, they come out with a score at the end that tells them that they might have some kind of mental health condition. And then they start to identify with it, which can make them ruminate and then can make them feel worse about themselves, therefore, actually potentially driving that slightly
Yeah.
worse mental health. So, yeah, have you come across this in your own clinical work?
Yeah, no, well, absolutely. I'm very aware of the work by Lucy Foulkes. I don't know if you know,
Yes.
or yeah,
Yeah.
Foulkes, and she's done a lot of research on this. And I think for parents, what I always try to suggest is that we need to think about frequency, about how often these the child is, or the young person's complaining. We need to think about how much they're able to take part in any aspect of normal, of, I don't like the word normal, but of everyday life. So
Mm-hmm.
is their anxiety or low mood or whatever affecting everything, or is it just affecting some things? And if it's affecting everything, that would be concerning. How long has it been going on? How severe? Are they able to talk about it? Are they ever able to reflect on what's happening? Is the one moment where they have a feeling of, oh, everything's terrible? And because I think a lot of young people will have moments of saying some very extreme sentences like, oh, my life's not worth living, or something. I mean, we obviously need to take those things very seriously, but are they saying that all the time, or was that just in a moment of stress? And are there other times where they seem to be engaged and able to, fulfilled in other aspects of their life? So I think those are some of the things that I would guide parents to talk about. We always want to validate how a young person feels, always. So it's never about belittling and saying, oh, don't be ridiculous. We would never recommend that. But
Mm.
I think there is something about adults around young people having to hold a to kind of hold firm about, not be pushed over by their emotions, if you like. So to be strong
Yeah.
enough to be able to guide them, and that's the tricky bit.
And giving a message that, I mean, obviously, unless some of the flags that you've highlighted have been picked up on, that these are emotional states that will pass,
Yes,
generally. So
exactly.
things might feel really awful at the moment, but
Yeah,
they will not always feel that way.
that's
It
right.
will pass, and as human beings, we're strong generally. We have
Yeah.
the tools to be able to handle this.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And as you say, having a conversation, saying, what do you think? What do you want to try? Maybe go and try a couple of things, helping them think about, if they want you to, what that might look like, and saying, let's check back in tomorrow or next week
Mm,
and see if that is still there for you. So it's being very respectful of it, but it's not jumping in going, okay, everything needs to stop, everything needs to change because you had a feeling. It's finding that
yeah,
balance, isn't it?
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And recognizing that there are great feelings as well as difficult ones as well,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
kind of having a sense of optimism.
Yeah, Oh, Matilda, thank you so much. I love the question that I think it's so important, and the research that you talked about is just so interesting. Research I haven't heard of before. So thank you so much for coming on today and talking. It's really
Thank you
helpful.
for having me. It's been a great pleasure.